Good morning. We finished the book of Genesis today, as I mentioned yesterday. Tomorrow we'll start on Exodus. I'll have a little introduction and then whatever the reading says, a chapter or two, whichever it is. But finishing today in Genesis 48-49, chapter 49 has Jacob calling his sons together. And he says, "Assemble and hear, O sons of Jacob, listen to your father Israel." So, he too was using both names. And so here, he's going to bless his sons, his 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel that we will hear about so often in the Bible, not only in the Old Testament, but also we hear references to the 12 tribes of Israel in the New Testament. And he names each one. I'm not going to read through each one's blessing, but he starts with Reuben, and then Simeon and Levi, our brothers, he says. Judah, your brothers will praise you. And remember, Judah was the one who in chapter 38 had gone away and then had come back. And Judah was the one who had promised his dad that I will look after your youngest son, Benjamin, when we take him to this man in Egypt that has demanded to see him. And so, Judah, there's a few more verses, it seems like, on Judah than on some of the others. Zebulun, not much about him, and Issachar and Dan and Gad and Asher and Naphtali. Really, just, short little blessings for them. Joseph, when we come to Joseph, this is where we have the biggest, longest probably blessing. And it's, Joseph was Jacob's favorite, Israel's favorite. And, the long lost son who provided so much for everybody. And, he says, blessings of the deep will lie beneath you, and the blessings of your father will be there. And then the final blessing to Benjamin, the ravenous wolf, as in the morning devouring prey. And then, the writer Moses tells us all these are the 12 tribes of Israel. And this is what their father said as he blessed them, blessing each one with a suitable blessing. And then it was, he charged his sons that when I die, take me down and put me in the grave in the field that Abraham bought from Ephraim the Hittite, and there Abraham and his wife Sarah and Isaac and his sons, and that is where I buried my wife, Rebecca and Leah, or Isaac and Rebecca were buried. That's not Rebecca, but Leah. So Jacob ended his charge of the blessing and his request to be laid to rest in the same tomb of his fathers and his forefathers, his ancestors. And then it says, chapter 50 starts out, Joseph threw himself upon his father's face and wept and kissed him. And after his father died, he commanded the physicians of Egypt to embalm him. And it took a process of 40 days, it says in the Bible. They spent 40 days in doing this, but that's the time required. And it says the Egyptians wept for him for 70 days. Jacob had lived in the land for 17 years after, I think that's right, so they had come to know who he was as well, but they probably mourned more for Joseph's sake. It was, kind of a national day of mourning. We do that here in the United States. We do that. We just celebrated Martin Luther King Day. We have President's Day coming up. We have days set aside that we honor people and all of those things. And then Joseph goes to Pharaoh and asks for permission then to take his father as per his father's request and bury him where it was. And so Pharaoh says, yeah, get up and go. And it says the elders of his household, all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as the household of Joseph, it says only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left. So it was a huge procession that left from Egypt to go back for the burial of Joseph. And the Canaanites, it says, when they saw what was going on, renamed this place because of the mourning that they were witnessing for this man, for this Jacob, who You know, when we look back, you know, and we talk about Father Abraham and how but still too, we realize too that Joseph lies within that ancestry. And it says, verse 14 of chapter 50, after he buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers, all who had gone with him to bury their father. And then the brothers start thinking, you know, what if Joseph is angry with us now that dad is dead? Now, maybe what's going to happen if Joseph decides to turn on us? And so they come up with this story. I mean, I don't really think that Jacob said to his older sons, you know, tell Joseph that I said that he should forgive you. I think they're putting words in his mouth a little bit, and that happens every once in a while. You know, that the people will put words in our mouths. I know people have put words in my mouth. I mean, I've heard that I said things that I know I never said. But anyway, so they come to his brother and they said, you know, this is what Dad said. Say to Joseph, I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong they did to you. Now please forgive the crime of the servant of God your Father. And Joseph says, you know, here, and I talked about this a day or two or so ago, but he says, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You know, he said, even though you intended to harm me, verse 20, even though you intended to harm me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people. And so Joseph realizes that, you know, God had worked good through this. And there's a verse in Romans 8 that brings heartache to some people, you know, but God doesn't rejoice in the bad things that happen to us. And it's sometimes hard for us to look for the good in things that hurt us. But, you know, it says all things work together for the good of God, you know, and or something like that. I don't have that exact quote, but, you know, God can do good things. God can bring good about from a lot of things. But, you know, when somebody's going through a hard time, this isn't the time to say, well, we got to wait to see what good God's going to bring out of this. That's not very comforting to people. But anyway, Joseph realizes, you know, and it's probably way after the fact. I mean, Joseph was sold into slavery. He was imprisoned falsely. He was, but yet through all of that, he realizes how blessed he was by God. And Joseph says, God intended it for good in order to preserve everything. But he says, am I in the place of God? And, you know, God is the one that forgives. I mean, we forgive others as well. And so this is where some of the Pharisees in the New Testament come out with Jesus saying, you know, your sins are forgiven. Rise, get up, take your mat and walk. I mean, and the Pharisees say, who can forgive sins but God alone? So here, you know, Joseph is saying, rather, am I in the place of God to forgive you? I mean, God did this. And, you know, so Joseph in his heart has already forgiven his brothers by the grace of God. And I think that for you and for me, to forgive someone, you know, if we don't forgive, if we hold that grudge, and I've talked about forgiveness before, I know, but it's something that we need to do. I mean, there are very few people that haven't done something to someone that needs forgiveness for. And if I don't forgive, I mean, that it hurts me more than it hurts the other person. I mean, if I hold a grudge, if I hang on to it, and, you know, and I just kind of, you know, it's like, you know, if Joseph had continued to hold that hatred for his brothers for selling him into slavery, you know, it never says in the Bible that Joseph hated his brothers. I kind of just put in there, but if Joseph had held that sin against his brothers all of those years and let that build, I mean, how much bitterness would have been within him? And so this forgiveness that comes by the grace of God, because we have been forgiven, we can forgive. It's like Jesus teaches us, you know, forgive those who trespass against you as I have forgiven you, you know, your trespasses. So, I mean, just as God forgives, we too can forgive. And we need to forgive more for our sake than for the other person's. Even though the other person may feel guilty and may bring it up again later, I mean, forgiveness is a two-way street. It helps the forgiver and the forgiven. And so we hear here that, Joseph is saying that, am I in the place of God to forgive this? Stating that, God has forgiven, and because God has forgiven, it has enabled Joseph to forgive. Because God forgives us, then it's easier for us to forgive others. It's not always easy to forgive. I won't say that at all. But Joseph assures his brothers that he holds no grudge against them, that nothing's going to happen to them. And in verse 21, he says, "Have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones." This 7-year famine and drought isn't over yet. So these brothers and their families are still somewhat dependent upon Joseph and Egypt and all of the stores that are in Egypt. And it says, in this way he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. And so he's saying, you are forgiven. You are in my grace. And this chapter ends, book of Genesis ends with Joseph's death. It says, so Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years, and he saw Ephraim's children to the third generation. So there were, Ephraim and 3 more generations, and then he saw Manasseh's son also born, or children of Manasseh's son also born on Joseph's knees. And when Joseph is dying, he's second youngest. But it says that when Joseph said to his brothers, "I am about to die," we don't know, if all 11 of his brothers were still alive or whatever, but some were still alive. And Joseph says to his brothers, "God will come and bring you out of this land that he swore to Abraham and take you to this promised land." So Joseph's last breath is a reminder to his brothers of God's faithfulness. And I think that's a wonderful way to end this chapter, this book of Genesis, to remember that God is faithful in all things.